The sun hung high and merciless over the cracked pavement of Elmbridge's forgotten street, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch out like silent witnesses to the day's unfolding drama. Officer Tuan stood rigid in the middle of the road, his badge catching the harsh glare, but his eyes bore none of the honor it symbolized. Instead, they glimmered with a cruel contempt, barely concealed beneath the veneer of law and order. Before him stood Mr. Min, an elderly man whose weathered face told stories no words could capture. Years of hardship, sacrifice, and battles both seen and unseen had etched deep lines into his skin. His eyes, however, remained sharp and steady, filled with the quiet dignity of a lifetime forged under fire. He wore the weight of his medals on his chest, each one a testament to a chapter of courage and pain. Yet today, those symbols of valor were about to become targets of scorn. Tuan's voice cracked through the heavy air, sharp and mocking. "Look at this relic," he sneered, stepping forward with the arrogance of youth. "What's the point of dragging your past around like a sack of old bones? You're just a walking joke, Grandpa." Mr. Min said nothing. His hands remained clasped calmly by his side, the steady rhythm of his breathing the only response to the verbal assault. Tuan, frustrated by the silence, lashed out, kicking at the medals pinned on Min's chest. The metallic clang echoed like a twisted anthem of disrespect. Each boot strike was deliberate, a cruel punctuation to the years of service and sacrifice those medals represented. The crowd nearby shifted uneasily, some averting their eyes, others frozen in disbelief. But no one dared step forward. The chasm between the young officer's ignorance and the veteran's silent strength was a wall no one seemed willing to breach. Tuan's sneer deepened. "Think these tin cans mean anything now? People don't bow down to yesterday's ghosts." His words dripped with venom, masking a deeper insecurity that he himself did not yet understand. He was a man desperate to assert control, wielding power not earned but assumed. But Mr. Min's gaze remained unmoved. It was not anger in his eyes nor bitterness, just the unyielding calm of a man who had seen too much to waste breath on empty provocations. His silence was a fortress, a refusal to feed the fire that Tuan so eagerly sought to ignite. For a fleeting moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The sun bore down harder, the distant hum of the town fading into a deafening silence that swallowed every cruel word and mocking laugh. Then, without a word, Mr. Min turned slowly, each movement deliberate, dignified. His shoulders, bent but unbroken, carried not just the weight of age, but the invisible scars of battles fought far beyond this street. Battles that no badge could protect, no badge could understand. As his worn truck creaked back to life, the faint glow of his medals caught the sun once more, reminders of honor amid humiliation. Officer Tuan watched, a smug smile creeping across his face, convinced of his victory. But the silence that followed was not defeat. It was the calm before a storm no one in Elmbridge had yet dared to imagine. What lay beneath that quiet exterior? What stories lingered in the eyes of the man just dismissed as a relic? And who might rise to answer the challenge of a young cop blinded by prejudice and youthful arrogance? The answers were waiting, unseen, beneath layers of dust and pride, ready to rewrite everything Elmbridge thought it knew about power, respect, and justice. Officer Tuan slid into his cruiser, chest rising and falling with shallow, triumphant breaths. The heat of the midday sun seemed to blaze only brighter now, as if the world itself was applauding his victory. He glanced in the rearview mirror, watching the battered truck of Mr. Min crawl down the cracked street like a tired ghost retreating from a battlefield long forgotten. A smug smile curled on Tuan's lips. In his mind, the confrontation was over. A clean win in a town that barely noticed the difference between justice and abuse of power. But beneath that surface pride lurked something Tuan could not see. The first tremors of a storm brewing quietly, far more dangerous than any reckless outburst could predict. Mr. Min's silence was not weakness. It was a shield, one forged from years of surviving horrors that most could never fathom. His stoic retreat was a calculated retreat, a deliberate pause before a reckoning no one in Elmbridge dared imagine. Far from the dusty street and the judgmental eyes of the town, a shadow moved with quiet purpose. Mr. Hung, son of Mr. Min, was no ordinary man. Clad in the understated uniform of an elite special forces commander, he embodied precision, discipline, and a lethal calm that unnerved even the most seasoned soldiers. Where others rushed in with noise and fury, Hung struck with silent inevitability. His phone vibrated sharply on the polished table in front of him. A short message, a video clip from Elmbridge, captured by a bystander. The image was raw. A young officer degrading an elderly man whose medals glinted faintly in the sunlight. The air hung thick with injustice, the cruel laughter of a man who believed himself untouchable. Hung's eyes narrowed, a cold fire igniting deep within. He did not flinch, did not raise his voice, but the room seemed to tighten around him as if responding to the weight of his unspoken command. That he knew the name of the officer, Tuan. A boy full of bluster and blind pride, desperate to prove himself in a town shackled by its own prejudices. Hung knew that beneath the thin veneer of control lurked insecurity, a dangerous mix that could unravel quickly if challenged. But Hung was no stranger to challenges across the country. His reputation was carved from missions shrouded in secrecy, victories won in shadows, where the slightest mistake meant death. He was a man who had faced enemies far more terrifying than a rookie cop's ignorance. And yet, the situation gnawed at him with a different edge. This was not a battlefield littered with distant threats. This was home, the son of a man who had given decades of his life to service, reduced in moments to humiliation by a blind force of authority. That was a personal wound Hung could not ignore as he rose from his chair. His movements precise and deliberate, a storm gathered in the depths of his mind. His hands clenched into fists, but his voice, when he finally spoke, was low and steady. "This isn't over." The words hung in the air, charged with quiet menace. Meanwhile, in the streets of Elmbridge, life tried to carry on, but the undercurrent of tension was unmistakable. Whispered conversations filled the dim corners of local cafes and crowded convenience stores. Some villagers expressed frustration, others fear. Many had seen the video. Few dared confront the truth aloud. The notion that power could be wielded without responsibility, that a man like Officer Tuan could trample on dignity with impunity, unsettled them all. Yet, fear held them silent. Who would challenge the badge? Who would stand up against a system built on blind obedience? But Hung was different. His presence alone radiated a warning. The rules of this town were about to change, whether it wanted to or not. Officer Tuan, riding high on his perceived triumph, remained oblivious. He joked with colleagues, mocking the veteran's age, his dignity, his quiet resistance. To Tuan, it was all a game, one he believed he had already won. But deep inside, a shadow of doubt crept in during the quiet moments. A restless unease he couldn't shake, like the faint echo of footsteps behind him in an empty alley. That was Hung's shadow. He was patient, he was strategic, and above all, he was unyielding. Tuan's arrogance was a fragile armor, soon to be cracked by a force born not just of skill, but of blood and unbreakable honor. The question was not if Hung would act, but when, and how devastating his response would be. Elmbridge, a town long content with comfortable lies and surface peace, was about to learn a brutal truth. Some silences conceal storms, and some quiet men carry the weight of thunder as the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long, ominous shadows. A new chapter began, one where the illusion of victory would shatter against the cold steel of justice, and for Officer Tuan, the reckoning was only just beginning. The video was nothing more than a few shaky seconds, yet it carried a weight far heavier than its brief runtime. A young bystander, standing just steps away from the scene, had captured the moment Officer Tuan's cruel boots shattered the silence around Mr. Min. The clip showed everything: the arrogance, the violence, the cold dismissal of a lifetime of honor. It was raw, it was real, and it was about to ignite a fire that Elmbridge could no longer ignore. Within hours, the footage rippled through social media feeds, shared, reshared, and dissected by voices that had long been muted or ignored. The once sleepy town, wrapped in a comfortable veil of complacency, woke abruptly, jolted by the undeniable evidence of injustice. Whispers turned into murmurs, murmurs into conversations, and conversations into a swelling tide of outrage. People who had passed Mr. Min without a second glance suddenly saw him, not just as an old man, but as a symbol of something much larger. A symbol of respect trampled beneath the heavy boots of power misused. At the local diner, where faded newspapers and lukewarm coffee were the usual companions, patrons gathered in uneasy clusters. Eyes darted around, wary of who might overhear, yet the stories spilled anyway. Mothers gripped their children's hands tighter. Elders exchanged glances filled with a mixture of sadness and determination. The undercurrent was clear. The town's patience had been stretched too thin. But this awakening was not loud. It was not flamboyant. It was a quiet resolve, the kind that simmers beneath the surface, gathering strength with every passing moment. Mr. Min, though broken in body, was unbroken in spirit. Within the walls of his modest home, he sat surrounded by silent companions, photographs of comrades long gone, medals dulled by time, letters that whispered tales of sacrifice. His eyes reflected the steady flame of resilience, a calm before a storm that was gathering. Others, veterans and townsfolk alike, watched the unfolding events with a new clarity. They did not rush to rallies or shout slogans in the streets. Instead, they prepared. They fortified their minds, sharpened their resolve, and kindled the courage that had been dormant for too long in the dimly lit rooms of a small community center. Conversations unfolded in hushed tones. Plans were made, not of confrontation, but of endurance. They would not give Officer Tuan or those like him the satisfaction of a battle fought with words. Their fight was deeper, steadier. A test of will, patience, and unyielding dignity. Yet, beneath the calm, nerves twisted like unseen currents. There was fear, too, fear of reprisal, fear of isolation, fear of the unknown consequences of standing up against entrenched power. The community had been bound for decades by invisible chains, held back by silence and the status quo. Now, those chains rattled ominously. The local pastor, known for his quiet wisdom, spoke one evening to a gathering of concerned citizens. His voice was soft but resolute. "Justice is not always loud," he said. "Sometimes it is the stillness that shakes the foundations." Outside, the town carried on its daily rhythm, oblivious to the undercurrent of change swelling beneath familiar faces. But every glance cast in Mr. Min's direction, every whispered conversation in shadowed corners, was a thread weaving a new tapestry, one of reckoning and hope. In the distance, the worn tires of Mr. Min's truck rolled slowly down the road, but behind them trailed something far less visible. A wave of solidarity, building quietly, waiting for its moment to crash. For Elmbridge, the days of blind obedience were ending. The community was waking, not with anger that burns and fades, but with a steady fire that could neither be ignored nor extinguished. And as night fell over the town, the weight of what was to come pressed heavily on every soul aware of the truth. The fight ahead would not be easy. The path was uncertain, marked by shadows of fear and the possibility of loss. But for those who had long suffered in silence, this was no longer a choice. It was a necessity. when Mr. Hung stepped into Elmbridge, he carried with him the weight of 1,000 unspoken words and the quiet fury of a storm long restrained. His presence was a paradox, calm, measured, yet infused with an undeniable authority that demanded attention without a single raised voice. To the town's restless murmur, he was a silent reckoning, a force emerging from the shadows to claim what had been trampled. Officer Tuan, once brimming with confidence, now found himself under a gaze far colder and far heavier than any badge could command. Hung did not waste time with empty threats or loud confrontations. His approach was deliberate, strategic, the kind of power that does not shout but makes its presence felt in the tightening grip around its target. The first sign that the tide was turning came not in a public spectacle but in the hushed corridors of the town's precinct. Hung's footsteps echoed quietly down the hallway, a subtle reminder that beneath the chaos of everyday law enforcement lay a higher order, one rooted in respect, honor, and accountability. Tuan's smug grin faltered the moment their eyes met. Hung's gaze was unwavering, sharp as a blade, slicing through the layers of arrogance and ignorance Tuan had wrapped around himself like a shield. The unspoken message was clear. The game had changed, and Tuan was no longer the player in control. Rumors began to spread swiftly through Elmbridge, whispers of a man who moved with the precision of a seasoned warrior and the resolve of a protector. Hung's influence rippled silently, unsettling the fragile balance Tuan had so carelessly exploited. In the days that followed, subtle shifts became impossible to ignore. Tuan's usual swagger diminished into wary steps. The confidence that once allowed him to mock and demean now gave way to a creeping unease. Doors once opened to him closed quietly. Colleagues exchanged cautious glances when he entered a room. The laughter that once accompanied his jabs at Mr. Min's expense turned to strained silence. Yet, Hung did not strike with overt force. His campaign was a silent battle, a war fought with patience, resilience, and the steady dismantling of Tuan's power base. He gathered evidence, built alliances, and sowed seeds of accountability where complacency had thrived. For Tuan, each day became a tightrope walk between maintaining authority and navigating the growing storm. His hands trembled behind closed doors, the mask of control cracked under pressure that no youthful bravado could withstand. But the conflict was not one-sided. Tuan's desperation gave rise to reckless moves, petty reprisals against those who dared to question him, whispered threats aimed at silencing dissent. The town held its breath, caught between fear and hope, watching the slow unraveling of a man who had believed himself untouchable. Amidst the tension, Mr. Hung remained an enigma, visible in his influence yet elusive in action. His restraint was not weakness but a measured power that unnerved more than any outburst could. The calm before the inevitable reckoning. The community sensed the shift. In quiet conversations and guarded expressions, they recognized that this silent battle was more than a personal vendetta. It was a fight for the soul of Elmbridge itself, the struggle between justice and corruption, respect and abuse, honor and humiliation. As the days grew shorter and shadows lengthened, the atmosphere thickened with anticipation. Every glance exchanged, every whispered word carried the weight of unspoken truths. The town was perched on the edge of change, teetering between the comfort of old patterns and the uncertainty of a new order. For Officer Tuan, the illusion of victory was slipping through his fingers like sand. The walls that once protected him closed in, cold and unyielding. The silent battle waged by Mr. Hung was stripping away his control, piece by piece, until all that remained was the stark reality of consequences long overdue. And for Mr. Hung, the fight had only just begun. With unwavering resolve, he prepared to ensure that justice would no longer be a whispered hope but an unshakable reality. In the stillness of Elmbridge's fading light, the silent battle raged on. Invisible to many, unstoppable to those who understood its true power, Officer Tuan's world began to crumble not with a bang, but with the quiet, crushing weight of reality. The arrogance that once draped him like a cloak had been stripped away, thread by thread, until he stood bare, exposed to the harsh glare of a community that no longer tolerated his presence. The arrest was swift and unceremonious. No dramatic chase, no last-minute pleas. Just the cold, unyielding handcuffs snapping around his wrists, the metallic click echoing louder than any shouting match ever could. The precinct's sterile walls closed in on him like a tomb, each moment inside shrinking the space where his pride once lived. Forced to face Mr. Min and the gathered townsfolk, Tuan's public apology was a hollow shell of words. The voice that spilled from his lips was fragile, cracked by the tremors of genuine fear. His eyes, once sharp and mocking, now darted nervously, searching for a flicker of mercy, a sign of forgiveness, anything to salvage what little dignity remained. But the silence that greeted him was deafening. Mr. Min stood tall, not with anger, but with a sorrow so deep it pierced the hearts of all who watched. His face bore the years of sacrifice and pain, yet his eyes reflected a forgiveness that was not weakness, but the strength of a man who understood that justice was not revenge. The crowd around them shifted uneasily. Some faces were wet with tears, others hardened with resolve. There was no celebration, no cheers, just the quiet, heavy weight of truth settling over Elmbridge. From that day forward, Tuan became a ghost in his own town. Doors once open slammed shut without a word. Familiar faces turned away in the streets, their eyes averted not out of fear, but disdain. Whispers followed him like shadows, reminders of the disgrace he could not wash away. Even the animals seemed to sense his fall. Stray dogs that once barked playfully in his direction now recoiled, their noses twitching as if sniffing the invisible scent of guilt and failure that clung to him. Birds scattered from trees overhead as he passed, their wings beating a silent chorus of rejection. Loneliness wrapped around Tuan like a suffocating fog. The night stretched endlessly, filled with the echoes of his own thoughts, regrets, anger, and the unbearable weight of knowing he had destroyed not just his career, but the fragile trust of an entire community. Yet, amidst the ruin of his life, there was no outcry, no pleas for redemption, only the stark, unyielding consequences of a man who had chosen to wield power without compassion, and found himself utterly powerless in return. One evening, as rain fell softly over the empty streets, Tuan sat alone in the dim light of his small, cold home. The walls seemed to close in, shadows dancing like ghosts of his past misdeeds. He reached out to touch the worn badge that once symbolized authority and pride, now nothing more than a weighty reminder of his downfall. Tears, unbidden and bitter, traced silent paths down his cheeks. For the first time, the full measure of his actions settled upon him, and the man who had once mocked a veteran's dignity was left to confront the ruin he had wrought. But the community, too, was changed. Elmbridge no longer whispered of fear or submission. It spoke instead of resilience, of standing tall in the face of injustice. Mr. Min's quiet strength had become a beacon, lighting a path toward healing and hope. In the hearts of those who had witnessed the fall of a man blinded by arrogance, there bloomed a fierce determination that no voice of cruelty would ever again drown out the quiet dignity of honor. And as the rain washed over the town, cleansing the streets and the wounds alike, Elmbridge began to breathe anew. A little wiser, a little stronger, and forever changed by the silent courage of a veteran and the inevitable fall of the abuser. Elmbridge was a town familiar with facades, polished surfaces hiding cracks too deep to mend overnight. After the storm of confrontation and consequence, its leaders scrambled to restore order, to paint over the truth with carefully orchestrated ceremonies and hollow speeches. Banners hung limp in the breeze. Words of gratitude floated through microphones like whispers without conviction. Yet beneath the surface, something far more powerful had taken root. The story of Mr. Min and his son, Mr. Hung, refused to be buried beneath the town's attempts at silence and denial. It grew, quietly, steadily, carried from neighbor to neighbor, echoed in schoolyards and kitchen tables, whispered between generations. What began as a simple act of defiance had blossomed into a living symbol of honor, resilience, and unwavering justice. For those who followed the unfolding events, Mr. Min was no longer just an elderly veteran. He was the embodiment of silent strength, the kind that does not shout but commands respect. His dignity in the face of humiliation inspired a profound lesson. True courage is often found in restraint, in holding on to one's principles even when the world demands surrender. Mr. Hung's role deepened the narrative. His calm authority and decisive action taught the community that justice is not delivered by loud proclamations or violent outbursts, but by steady, thoughtful resolve. In him, people saw the power of protecting what matters most: family, honor, and the truth, without losing sight of the values that make a leader worthy of respect. The town's children learned through whispered stories and subtle gestures that standing up for what is right often requires quiet bravery. The elders nodded knowingly, recognizing in this story a reflection of their own struggles and hopes. Elmbridge was no longer a place where injustice could hide behind badges and uniforms. It was a community awakening to the idea that every individual holds the power to make a difference. This narrative carries a lesson far beyond the streets of Elmbridge. It reminds us all that dignity and resilience are contagious, that the courage to face wrongs, no matter how daunting, can ripple outward, transforming hearts and minds. It teaches us that the mightiest battles are not always fought with weapons or words, but with unwavering commitment to justice and humanity. To everyone reading this, let the story of Mr. Min and Mr. Hung be a beacon. Remember that standing firm in your values, protecting those who cannot protect themselves, and seeking justice with patience and honor are the greatest acts of strength we can offer. And even when the world seems ready to ignore or suppress the truth, resilience will find its way through. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of the power of quiet courage and justice, please subscribe to our channel. Join us as we continue to share real, raw stories that inspire change, illuminate human strength, and remind us all why dignity matters. Together, we can learn, grow, and make a difference, one story at a time. Thank you for being part of this journey.